I'd like
somewhere in between. Good afternoon, or is it good evening? Welcome. My name is Uriah Kim, and I am the Dean of the Graduate Theological Union. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of the GTU, I would like to welcome each and every one of you to the reception in honor of Professor Carolyn Merchant. My welcome remark will be brief, because I must confess that I do not know anything about Dr. Merchant's work. But I know two things about her based on my personal observation and what I have heard from other people. First, she is a giant. This conclusion is based on the enthusiasm and adoration shown by Rita Sharma and Devin Zuber whenever they talk about her. They were very forceful and insisted that we must host a reception in her honor, that she influenced a generation of students, not only from UC Berkeley, but also from the DTU. And she single-handedly shaped discipline of environmental ethics, and on and on and on. So I thought she must be a giant. Now, I have met my share of academic giants in my career, and I must say some of them behave like they are made up of something other than stardust, more than flesh and blood. So I was curious when I got a chance to meet her last month over lunch, and to my surprise and delight, she was so down to earth that I forgot that she was a giant. I was enjoying my sandwich when she asked, "How did you get here?" I kept on chewing, thinking about how am I going to move this conversation to another person as quickly as I can. So I gave her a very simple and generic answer. She wanted to know more. So I gave her a little more detail. She wanted more. And I continued until I reached Machu Picchu with a missionary's daughter on my side, contemplating whether I should go to seminary and become a missionary myself in order to win this woman's heart. I was surprised that she was genuinely interested in my story and in me. I'm sure your experience is similar to mine. She wants to know your story, wants to know you. She cares about your story and about you. Professor Merchant, we need to have another lunch if you want to hear what happened after Machu Picchu. Okay. It may have to be your treat. Professor Merchant, you are an earthly giant who knows from where you come from and also where you will return, just like every other earthling. That's why I like you. We're indeed honored and happy to have you here with us. Welcome.
Thank you.
Uriah is always a hard act to follow, but I wanted to welcome you on behalf of myself and Professor Devin Zuber. We are the co-chairs of the Graduate Theological Union's sustainability initiative, which is called Sustainability 360. The initiative started last year. We have done several conferences. 2 edited volumes are already on its way. We are also working with students on their projects and outreach to our communities. And we are trying to change the face of sustainability studies from being completely rooted in the very paradigms and epistemologies that got us to where we don't want to be. And bring in humanistic perspectives into sustainability studies. So last year in April, we had our first Sustainable Societies Interdisciplinary Interreligious Responses Conference. The edited volume from that is on its way. And at the same time, Devin Zuber helped convene a conference titled Redo, which he will explain more of. And my personal interest in this, other than the fact that it aligns with what we feel so passionately about, is a little story that I have mentioned to Caroline. That when I was a first-year master's student, I entered Claremont Graduate University in Southern California. And I didn't go there to do ecology or ecology and religion, environmental studies. No, I went there to do comparative theology. And I went to a class in feminist theory. And the first book I came across was The Death of Nature. It changed my life. My entire academic career since then moved into the area of religion and ecology, and now with religion and sustainability. And both Carolyn Merchant and Susan Griffin have been dialoguing with my work unknown to them for a very long time. It is an incredible honor for me personally and for Devin and myself to have them both with us. Thank you, Devin.
I'll keep my remarks brief because we wanted to get to the heart of the evening, which is the conversation between Susan and Carolyn. Some of you who are here for the first time might be wondering why begin a symposium for Carolyn at the GTU. And the answer is all around us. There are over 14 PhD students who had Carolyn on their committee by my count, maybe more. And I would like to read some of those names out. And if you happen to be here as one of those students who had Carolyn on your committee, if you would just raise your hand. Tim Robinson, Ray McNamara, Greg Zuschlag, Paula Sampson, Judith Scoville, Ron Feldman. There we go.
Somebody.
Kate Alexander, Courtney Goulden, Dana Spotswood, Hyuk Kim, and Whitney Bauman. I know Whitney's here.
He's here.
He is. He might be moving Susan's car to a better. And we would like to very briefly suggest the ways in which, even though Carolyn has been emerita for some time, the legacy of her thought continues at the GTU, both with the Sustainability 360 initiative, but also with current projects afoot at the GTU. So I would now like to invite 2 current PhD students, Kojin and Matt, to step forward and briefly introduce themselves and just talk about how Carolyn is impacting their ongoing dissertation work. So let's start with Kojin.
Hello, my name is Cody Bohannon, and I'm a PhD student here at the Graduate Theological University Union. And the school, right? It is university. Oh, got me wrong somewhere. So I'm doing my PhD work on a Gaudiya Vaishnava ecofeminist reading of the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. And of course, my PhD dissertation is very much inspired by the work of Dr. Merchant. Even the name of the book, The Death of Nature, really incites people across academic disciplines to really examine how their work can address what is perhaps the most important issue of our time. The issue is novel in terms of its scope and effect on the planet, and even ancient religious traditions have to examine how their beliefs and how their views and how their practices can help address that issue of the environmental destruction. Also, in terms of ecofeminism, it's really an important point that Dr. Merchant has contributed to the development of the idea of the intersectional relationship between the devaluation of the feminine and the destruction of nature. And again, as a theologian, it's very, very important to look at how our traditions are addressing that particular issue. Also, a critique of modernity is a very, very important aspect of doing eco-theological work and understanding how it is that the modern Enlightenment thought has reduced nature to a thing, and how we can see divine sacredness and reevaluate and reassess the paradigms that have us value nature and see nature as less than. So these are all very, very important aspects of Dr. Merchant's work that I personally have very much benefited from. So I want to thank you very much for your work, for your presence, and for inspiring students like me and all that we do. Thank you.
Well, my name is Matthew Hartman. I'm in my first year here at the in the doctoral program here at the GTU. I'm studying environmental ethics and climate justice. And so I was thinking about how Professor Merchant's work has influenced my own research, which actually coincides with when I first became interested in environmental studies back when I was doing my master's. And so I was doing work in phenomenology and in continental philosophy. I studied philosophy for a while. It's particularly at this time when I was focusing on Levinas and quite larger questions of how we think about ethics. And I was really interested in how to think about domination as a sort of universal ethical issue that demands a reconceptualization of the other. I remember my advisor at the time pushing me to look at this notion of domination, not just in sort of abstract philosophical terms, but in more specific manifestations of violence. The historical subjugation under institutions of slavery and colonialism, which very explicitly link the domination of nature and the violence historically done to women. And my advisor suggested some authors and readings that would go on to profoundly impact my own research. Among them, Susan Griffin, Rosemary Redford Ruther, and Merchant. And really just the history of this work that was going on in this place is really something special. But the influence of Professor Merchant's work for me is how it disrupts the normative trajectory of knowledge production on the male-dominated space of the histories of philosophy and epistemology, of which the scientific revolution and its mechanistic processes are a part and continue to influence our policies and frameworks. Professor Merchant's work, The Death of Nature in particular, draws from the environmental and women's movements, bringing together challenges to domination and cultural and dare we say, academic hegemony. And this work has both added to existing discussions and generated new efforts in exploring the intersections of domination and oppression. And I also think about how Professor Merchant's Death of Nature is still almost uncannily relevant today in our contemporary efforts to grapple with the ongoing climate crisis, as the legacy of the mechanical view of nature continues to pervade our epistemological frameworks, as capitalism reasserts itself over again in neoliberal adaptation and mitigation efforts, and as narratives to address the climate crisis promote a category of the human that often recenters white male subjects of privilege. So Professor Merchant's work continues to challenge us and myself to rethink the language that we use, the categories that we create, and the methodologies and frameworks with which we work. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your important contribution, and thank you for the many scholars you have shaped and inspired.
There's rarely a time more appropriate to say that someone needs no introduction. But I will introduce Dr. Merchant because we have a lot of GTU students here who are familiar with her name, but not necessarily with the breadth of her work. So Professor Carolyn Merchant stands as one of the most influential scholars in environmental studies, a pioneer in two fields, environmental history and ecofeminism. She has published a highly significant body of thought in a dozen books and over 100 articles. The Graduate Theological Union is delighted and honored to host this reception and plenary discussion by her with Dr. Susan, with Professor Susan Griffin. And, you know, in honor of her pioneering scholarship and coinciding with the publication of the forthcoming book, Science and Nature, Past, Present, and Future, you can visit the desk back there at Rutledge. This is forthcoming, but her other books are back there. And a volume reflecting on her groundbreaking contributions to environmental humanities titled, appropriately, After the Death of Nature, Carolyn Merchant and the Future of Human-Earth Relations. And the editors are Professors Worthy, Ellison, and Bauman. Plenary presider for this event and her interlocutor, if I may say so, and friend, will be internationally renowned ecofeminist philosopher Professor Susan Griffin, who teaches at CIIS, and she is a Guggenheim Fellow for Creative Arts and a Pulitzer Prize nominee, with over 20 books and a leading voice in ecology and ecofeminism. And I turn it over to them.
I think there's not much more to say. I will just put in setting the frame for the dialogue that's about to begin, that before there was the death of nature, there was woman in nature, and how wonderful on the 40th anniversary of that landmark text that launched ecofeminism to host you in dialogue with Carolyn. So let's warmly welcome our two guests and get right into the conversation.
It's wonderful to be here, to see so many wonderful friends and so many wonderful faces. And I just want to say that what Susan and I are going to talk about, first, we're going to talk about how each of us came to the idea of connections between women and nature. Then we're going to talk about how Susan and I met and where and how important that was. Then we are going to talk about what comes out of the women and nature connection, which is ecofeminism, and what it is, how it got started, and where it is today. And then we are going to talk about what each of us is working on at the present moment that may be bringing our origins up to right the present. Great. So Susan is going to start and talk about how she came to the connections.
With that schedule, you might amend your schedules because we'll be here for about 3 hours now. Anyway, yeah, it's just thrilling to be here with you, Carolyn. It's wonderful because
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, we gave each other courage, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I was trying to think. I wrote a preface to Woman in Nature, the new edition, that talks about the origins. But I always find new origins as I'm thinking about this question. One is that I grew up in California. I was a real California kid. I wasn't particularly athletic, but every California kid in the period when I grew up went camping in the Sierras and, you know, swimming in the Pacific Ocean. It was we were more outdoors people than our East Coast counterparts, and And so I had a very profound relationship already with nature, and an experience of the natural world being intelligent and communicating with me. And you talked about that wonderful experience. I won't, but Carolyn talked about this encounter that was almost mystical. And I had an encounter when I was just 5 years old with a field of grass. And you wouldn't think that's so extraordinary, but even though California had a lot of wilderness places, Los Angeles itself was largely concrete. And so to encounter a field of grass was very thrilling to a 5-year-old, and I was mesmerized. And then the work that I started as a young writer, I did a piece on rape. It was an article, actually. And I came to realize, both through my interviews with rape victims and also through the work of a sociologist named Menachem Amir, who studied rapists in prison, that rape is an act of domination more than a sexual act. That men aren't seeking sexual pleasure in raping as much as they're linking erotic pleasure with domination, and domination is the main goal. So and I had a lot of other influences. One of them was James Baldwin as a writer and the civil rights movement. I was part of the civil rights movement before the reemergence of the feminist movement. And I learned the language of liberty and oppression from that movement. And I also learned courage from that movement. So, and so did many other feminists. Some of the other influences I had were Virginia Woolf, Simone de Beauvoir, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, because our attitude towards death is at the center of all of this. And then finally, I was invited by the Department of Agriculture, wasn't it? Because Carolyn was there, right? I was invited to deliver a lecture on feminism and ecology and the environment. And I had to protest. I said, well, I'm not an activist. I feel very strongly about the ecological movement, but I'm not an activist. I'm going to have to speak philosophically. And they said, fine, go ahead. And so I made a connection between the difficulties that a single mother, which I was then, had in trying to recycle, because then you had to bring it to a center if they didn't come to your house. And I had a baby, and I was doing a lot of my transportation on a bicycle. So, how was I gonna achieve this? And I had a rather unpleasant exchange with a man who put me down for finding this very difficult to do. And so I did a little research into it and found out that the major polluters, I'm very glad we have recycling for household garbage, but in fact, the major polluters then, as in now, were industries and corporations, not households. And that, I made a connection, being very philosophically minded and having been raised in a biblical tradition. I made a connection to the story of Eve having brought death into the world. That Eve made the mess, and now it's modern women making a mess of the environment, not the real, not the real dominators, the corporations.
So I go on.
And now, yeah.
Okay, so that's fantastic, Susan. Really inspiring to me. And I did not come to this when I was 5 years old at a field of grass. However, I came to the connections actually not until I was a graduate student, because I had been in chemistry and physics, and I went to Wisconsin and Madison. I became a graduate student, and I got married to a guy named Hugh Iltis, who was an ardent environmentalist, and two of his sons are here, and two others are on their way. But anyway, in 1962, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring came out, and Hugh got a hold of it and read it, and I read it, and I was very excited about it. And so Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962 was a big inspiration to me. And one of the things that I did with Hugh on our first date, we went out and burned a prairie. And he was interested in preserving the Wisconsin prairies, which were being taken over by aspen and all sorts of plants that were not indigenous to the area. So we went out to the teaching prairie north of the university with, we went out and drove out there. We got out and we walked around, and Hugh told me all about the prairie and the plants there. And then he took, out of his pocket, he took out a book of matches. And he started throwing these lighted matches on the prairie, and it started on fire. And we went back, we got in the car and drove around and watched it burn. And the people across the street called the fire department, and eventually they came and put it out. So that was my introduction to saving the environment and how you did it by burning prairies. Well, the next year, 1963, I was still a graduate student, and Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique came out. And the Feminine Mystique was all about women and how important it was for women who had been active in World War II, but now they were put back in their homes to come forth again. Well, Hugh didn't like this book, and he threw it out the window. However, these two books really formed my subsequent interest and the coming together of women and nature.
Wonderful.
So we're going to talk now about how we came together.
Yeah. We were at a party, right? I mean, we can sort of do this more collaboratively.
Right.
We went to a party. We're trying to figure out. I mean, Carolyn was there when I gave that lecture, but this was after that, because then I started generating ideas for the book. And we were at this party, and I was talking to her about matter, which had become a kind of I don't know, an obsession with me, the culture's attitude towards matter. And it was my argument with Marxism. It's so interesting because I was came from political movements that were Marxist, and then I started arguing with Marx, not over his politics, but over his philosophical idea of, to my mind, he just took Hegel and reversed him, and so then, but it's still looking at matter as not containing spirit, although in his early writing, I guess he did somewhat. So, I objected to the word materialism, and, and finally it generated the idea for a book that became Woman in Nature. I met Carolyn and I was talking to her about matter, and she knew immediately what I was saying. And other people would their eyes would glaze over, and what the hell are you talking about, And this hostility towards matter that's so much a part of our culture, and still today, it comes disguised as a spiritual attitude, as if matter doesn't have within it significance and intelligence. So I was so delighted to find somebody else who had the same approach to matter. And one of the things that you contributed to Woman in Nature was the understanding of the role that the witch burnings played in the scientific revolution. It was just a somewhat casual remark at a party, but it was really revelatory. And I'll just read a couple of lines from that. And by the way, the first version, an early version of Carolyn's The Death of Nature, is with a different title and under the authorship of Carolyn Iltis, is footnoted in the notes. Yeah. So I'm just starting sort of a little bit late, but 1482, Leonardo da Vinci moves to Milan and begins his notebooks on hydraulics, mechanics, anatomy. He paints Madonna of the Rocks. Does she see the body of St. Michael, they ask her? Did he come to her naked? Now those are questions that were asked of Joan of Arc before she was burned at the stake. 1523, 1,000 witches burn in a single year in the Diocese of Como. 1543, Vesalius publishes De Humani Corporis Fabrica. 1543, Copernicus publishes De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium. She is asked if she is in a state of grace. She is asked if St. Margaret speaks English. 1571, I love that, if St. Margaret speaks English. They asked her that, literally. 1571, Johannes Kepler born. 1572, Augustus Pius issues Consultationes Saxonicae, stating that a good witch must be burned because she has made a pact with the devil. So it goes on like that through the whole period of the scientific revolution.
Party, which I think was a political event.
It was.
It was for Berkeley politics. And one of the things that I did when I first got to Berkeley, I got involved first in the Peace and Freedom Party, and then I got involved in the April Coalition, and then the Berkeley Citizens Action, and so on. And this was a political event. And Susan and I were talking, and then I remember us sitting on the floor together and continuing this dialogue. And we were both interested in this issue of women and nature and how they were connected, and especially historically in the scientific revolution.
Yes.
So then our paths diverged again.
Yes.
And
we went back to our studies.
And this was around 1974. Well, Susan's book came out in 1978, Woman and Nature. And I was working on writing The Death of Nature. And I was over at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences in Stanford, just every day, every minute, writing the first draft of this book that became The Death of Nature.
Yeah.
And so however, I wrote an article in 1981. So I didn't reference Woman and Nature because I hadn't seen it when I was over there buried in the books and there was no internet and so on.
I mean, what it was like, you remember, many of you remember, I mean.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Some of you.
Some of you, anyway.
Anyway, but in 1981, I wrote an article, and in my article, I quoted the last lines of Woman and Nature, and I talked about Susan and what her, let's see, where's the last line
here? It's way at the end.
Okay. Anyway, I quoted Susan because that was when, by 1981, there were this big intersection between women and the environment, and women were out there in full force saving the environment. And so in this article, I was talking about all the things that women were doing to save the environment. And this is what I wrote. I know I am made from this earth as my mother's hands were made from this earth, as her dreams came from this earth, and all that I know in this earth, the body of the bird, this pen, this paper, these hands, this tongue speaking, all that I know speaks to me through this earth, and I long to tell you, you who are earth too, and listen as we speak to each other of what we know. The light is in us. I
have to tell you that it's one of the few times that I actually wrote the ending before I wrote the rest of the book.
Very good. Well, see, that's why I quoted it. Yes. So from then, by then it's 1980 and 1981, and suddenly burst on the scene is this idea of ecofeminism. And so The Death of Nature came out. Okay, people said nature is dead. Now what? What do we do now? And I heard in one of the classes I was teaching about this major conference that was being held by Yanestra King in Amherst, Massachusetts. And it was about women and life on Earth. I've got the original
that's incredible.
thing.
That's great.
A conference on ecofeminism in the 80s, March 21st to 23rd, 1980, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So this is when ecofeminism burst on the scene in the United States.
Yes.
But the term ecofeminism had actually been generated in France and perhaps other places in Europe by Françoise Dubon. And Françoise Dubon started in 1972 a center called the Ecological the Ecology Feminism Center. And then in 1974, she published a book called Feminism or Death. And in there was a chapter called The Time for Ecofeminism. And that book, however, was in French.
And it was, again, speaking of how things were different, you couldn't just go on the internet and find it, you know. So I was very, very curious about this book, but I didn't know how to get a hold of it. Short of, you know, flying over to Paris when I didn't have the funds to do that.
And she ended it with the phrase, "The planet placed in the feminine will flourish for all." So that was, but we didn't learn that until later.
Yeah.
Yes. And so what were some of the other things that happened was that in 1892, a major scientist named Ellen Swallow Richards introduced the term ecology to the United States.
Yeah.
And she had heard about it from Ernst Haeckel. She visited his laboratory, but she never met him in Germany. And he had coined the term ecology, but nobody knew it over here.
Yeah.
And so she introduced the term. And of course, it's always attributed to men.
Yeah.
And the men are given the credit for introducing the term, but she did it.
She did. She was an extraordinary woman, and she also introduced the whole study of home economics. And but the way that it was studied then was not sort of like teach every girl to sew and cook, but it was a whole philosophical approach about the importance of the home and the meaning of things that go on.
And she called it home. She called it human ecology.
Yeah,
that's what she called it. And what she was interested in was the home is situated in water and air and earth, and things come into the home and they change and affect people in the home, and then they go out as pollutants. So this was ecology.
Yes,
this was home ecology.
Yeah, yeah, and ecology and alchemy.
Yeah, and then of course we come to 1962 and Rachel Carson.
Yes,
and I want to also commend two graduate students at the time in the geography department at Cal, and they were Sandra Marburg and Lisa Watkins. And I happened to meet them when I was teaching in a course at Cal. and they started a conference, and it was called Woman and Environment. And that was a major connection.
Yeah.
And it's called A Gathering of Concerned Persons Meeting and Discussing Solutions to the Most Crucial Threats to Life. So that was an early connection.
Yeah.
And I also just wanted to tell you first, go back a minute. This is the newspaper article about Ellen Swallow Richards that came out, and it says, "New science, boot and shoe men at the christening." It was the boot and shoe club that she gave this talk to. And it says, "New science, Mrs. Richards names it ecology."
That's wonderful. What a treasure.
The art of first-class living.
Yeah. So I want to make a slight detour here, because I just wanted to read you regarding, because we're here, celebrating Carolyn's great work, and I'm just going to read you a couple of segments from The Death of Nature, because they're so relevant still today, and the thought is so clear. The mechanical view of nature now taught in most Western schools is accepted without question as our everyday common sense reality. Matter is made up of atoms, colors occur by the reflection of light waves of differing lengths, bodies obey the law of inertia, common sense to our 17th century counterpoints. The replacement of the older natural ways of thinking by a new and unnatural form of life, seeing, thinking, and behaving, did not occur without a struggle. The submergence of the organism by the machine engaged the best minds of the times. So we're still dealing with that now. Instead of the machine, it's pixels and
Right.
The computer world. And there's one other section I want to read to you from. Well, first let me say that sometimes it's been said that ecofeminists are essentialists. And that's an absurd claim.
Right.
There are perhaps some people among ecofeminists who are essentialists, but in fact, among feminists, ecofeminists are the least essentialist, because one of the claims of ecofeminism is that gender itself is constructed, and so that and it's constructed around a fissure that we have with nature, our split from nature. Gender is based on our alienation from nature. And one of the things that Carolyn has done so beautifully in her work is to draw the historical connections between feminism and the environment and colonialism, for instance. And I love this passage. With the ecological, I'm starting here, she's talking about the ecological revolution in southern New England, and you know that book. And to colonists, civilizing, quote unquote, the Indians meant converting their female-dominated shifting horticultural production into male-dominated settled farming. Despite the power of women in production, colonial fathers dealt only with Indian males. And so this, of course, disrupted entirely a society that was very egalitarian and gave equal, if not more, power to women.
Yeah. So ecofeminism evolved first what we think of as liberal ecofeminism, that argued that women and men are equally intelligent and they should have equal pay and they could do everything, but women could do everything mentally that men could do. And then we had an evolution of it called cultural ecofeminism, in which women began to look back to the goddesses of the ancient world, Charlene Spretnak,
Gloria Ornstein,
yes, and they
organized a great conference in 1987.
And this is Gloria Ornstein's conference.
Yes,
it's called Ecofeminist Perspective, and it is at the University of Southern California, March 27th to 29th, 1987. And it was in honor of the 25th anniversary of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring.
Marvelous. Yeah.
And so anyway, there were a lot of women who gathered on hilltops and worshipped in the full moon, and women who worshipped the ancient goddesses and called on the goddesses from the 4 different directions to come to their gathering, and all of that was wonderful.
And reviving Wicca, which Starhawk, who's still doing that, and still rebel-rousing.
Starhawk. And then we had what we called radical and socialist ecofeminism, social ecofeminism and socialist ecofeminism. And they just, social ecofeminism came out of Murray Bookchin's work on anarchist ecology in Vermont. And that's where Unestra King emerged from when she did her first courses and this conference. And they said, no, nature is not a female goddess. Nature is something that we need to interact with and take our subsistence from, and give all our men and women equal in subsistence life. And then we had socialist ecofeminism, which comes out of James O'Connor's work down in Santa Cruz. And that was a feminist version of O'Connor's social.
Yes. And I think now there isn't that opposition anymore. I think and particularly because of a lot of alliances with indigenous cultures, and understanding of the wisdom of indigenous cultures is to actually have reverence for nature, and to have a reverent I-thou relationship with nature. I mean, it exists in our culture. I-thou is a term I'm taking from Martin Buber, whose work I love.
Right, and a lot of ecofeminism now is in the third world and in the developing world, and they sometimes don't call it ecofeminism, but it's what they are doing.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Women saving the environment all over the planet.
By the way, it's happening right here in Berkeley. There's an attempt to save a site on 4th Street that was an Ohlone burial mound.
Right.
And if you live in Berkeley, or if you care about such things, please look it up on the internet and do what you can to support this effort.
So now we're just going to briefly say what we're working on now.
Oh, good. Okay.
And then we're going to do a little activity.
Oh, that's right. I forgot we're going to do that. Okay.
Yeah. So, okay. So you,
shall I go first? Yeah. I'm writing
just briefly.
Briefly, I'm writing a book called Strongman. Guess who it was inspired by. And those of you who are older or who know your history know that strongman is not it's a pejorative term. It's not a compliment. And one of the chapters, I believe it's the 4th chapter, is called The War Against Reality. And it's about, among other things, it's about the empty economic system where there are all these stocks sold that are based on no real, true material value. And it's also about the denial of climate change. And I tie this to the way that men are often battered out of their own emotional and sensual life, bullied and battered. Military training is the most obvious form, but it happens on the schoolyard too. And they're forced to give up their sensual and emotional lives, and that it's that life that would allow them to really understand the climate change we're facing on a visceral level, and it's that kind of visceral level understanding that we sorely need right now.
Okay, so what I'm working on is a book on the Anthropocene and what is happening to the 21st century as a result of putting fossil fuels into the atmosphere, and how it is affecting especially women in terms of climate change. And my graduate student, Julie Gorecki, who is here and helped organizing the conference, is that's her major work for her dissertation.
Wonderful.
So what I would like to do is to ask two women and two men to volunteer and come up here and just, you're going to read a paragraph. So, Jenny, are you coming up? Okay, and okay, and so.
And I'm going to read from this.
Yeah, so you're going to read just the first.
Yeah.
Okay, so here is where are the two guys? Come on, guys.
Don't be shy.
All right.
Good for you. Yeah.
Okay, so you're number 2.
Okay.
You're number 3.
What do I read?
You read number 1.
Number 1
is
the treason. Yeah. Treason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think your pagination is a little different.
Yeah. It's okay.
Okay, one more guy. Come on. Oh, good.
Oh,
Oh, okay. Excellent. Here you are. Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
So no more one.
So
we got, okay, so Susan is number 1.
Oh, okay. Number
You're
2.
number 2. Oh, you're number
Okay.
2. You're number 3. You're number 4. And then you're number 5.
is there a text?
Yes.
Yes, right here.
Okay.
Here.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Should I start?
Yeah.
Okay. This is from Woman in Nature.
And the title of the chapter.
How the forest, the whole chapter is called Timber, and this section is called How the Forest Should Look. It was inspired by various manuals on the textbook of lumber and office management. The trees in the forest should be tall and free from not causing limbs for most of their height. They should not taper too much between the butt and the top last saw log. They should be straight. Among applicants, a person with high intelligence should be sought. She should be an expert typist, a stenographer. She should be diplomatic, neat, and well-dressed.
Okay, number 2.
Trees in a forest should be useful trees. For each tree, ask if it is worth the space it grows in. Ask scrub pine, chokecherry, black gum, scrub oak, dogwood, hemlock, beech are weed trees, which should be eliminated. 1,000 cubic feet of one species can be worth more than the same quantity of another. Standard procedures for clerical work should be initiated. Find out the purpose of each kind of work. Ask, is this work necessary? Find out which species are of highest value to the consumer and plant these.
For harvesting trees, it is desirable that a stand be all of the same variety and age. Nothing should grow on the forest floor, not seedling trees, not grass, nor shrubbery. Parentheses. In one case, 19 girls, all working on the same operation, were using.
In the well-managed forest, poor and surplus trees have been thinned to make room for good trees. In such a forest, there is no room for overripe trees, past their best growing years. These trees are damaged trees, branchy or badly shaped trees. Is she accurate, neat in her work and personal habits? Is she loyal? Can she be trusted? Is she courteous? Does she have a pleasing telephone personality? The forest is more easily managed if it is large, and the trees should be planted close together so they will grow straight and tall to reach the light. There should be one central stenographic pool to render service for the entire office instead of small groups of uncontrolled stenographers throughout the office.
Is she emotionally stable? Is she responsible, versatile, creative, consistent, confident? Does she have a good memory? Is she alert to the needs of others? Does she try her best? Can she spell? Does she learn from? The forest should be close to a sawmill. When the work is centralized, each stenographer will produce more than would otherwise be the trees bred to grow more rapidly, to be more healthy, sounder, taller, thicker, straighter, and of more use to the consumer should gradually replace their inferiors. The study of human aptitudes the selection of the human element best fitted to perform any task. In this way, the forest will yield, and yield again is desired.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, wonderful. I just love that and the comparison. That's women in nature.
Yeah, there it
I have
is.
a question.
Yeah.
It looked like it was written almost in free verse form when you put it in there.
Yeah, I put it in free verse form.
Yeah. So
Yeah, but
people
I
use
took, I took it from these textbooks, you know.
Right. But anyway, what you need to know is in the book, it's written in free verse form and not in a standard paragraph.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, for the music, yeah.
Yeah. So we're now just going to open it up and ask if people have comments or questions or ideas that they want to share with us about where we are today in women and nature.
Don't all talk at once, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
The two things. One is when we talk about nature to some people, they'll say, well, what you talk about is no nature is separate from us.
Yeah.
Why do you keep saying that? So some traditions will say we're part of nature as well. So it's kind of defeats the argument sometimes to try and talk to people who don't believe in this matter. So how to get around that one? To say, well, we say, well, we're all part of nature, then what really is all about? I wonder what reflections you might have on that, or how to address that argument again. And secondly, didn't I just see a reference to Gaia? Could you tell us something about where does Gaia come into this? I just completely out of ignorance.
Yeah. Well, Gaia was introduced actually in the work by Charlene.
Oh, was it?
Charlene Spretnak before Lovelock.
Before Lovelock.
Yes.
Yes.
So there's a woman and nature connection for you right there.
Yeah.
But the Gaia hypothesis of nature as active and Gaia as being much larger and all the interactions between the oceans and the atmosphere, and that humans are just one part of that. But
systems theory.
Systems
Yes,
theory,
systems
yes,
theory is very close
exactly.
to this.
Exactly.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm very, I'm very aware of this kind of way of talking about nature as something that, well, it's the park over there, but this where we are right now is nature too. But it's sort of, there has to be some way of talking about the way that nature is imprisoned by human culture. So human culture is part of nature, but it also can operate against nature. So it's very complex and difficult. It's difficult.
So more a dialectical relationship.
It's a more dialectical relationship, definitely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, other comments, questions?
Gavin
I
has
have one.
Yes.
So because we're at the GTU, I'll ask a GTU kind of question. I wonder if either of you could comment on what you see about the role religion, broadly construed, has to play in the Anthropocene. And I'm very struck in both of your foundational texts that the nature, women in nature, there is a critique of the disenchanted world of the modern and the secular. So what's the space beyond for us on this quickly warming planet in the 21st century? Does religion have viability in some form or way?
Yes, I think religion definitely has quite a lot of viability and more than viability, it has a very important role to play. And again, I'd like to refer to the I-thou relationship, that nature is not an it, it's a thou, it's a you, and that seems to be a central religious concept. It's not always taught that way, but I think it should be. And that when you understand that nature has intelligence, I mean, there's all these studies now. It's now some, when we used to talk about this, and we did as ecofeminists very early, but now there are all these scientific studies that are showing, that Simard, is her name Simard, who her work on forests and Kimmel, is that you know, who work and her work with sweetgrass. And there's all these studies that absolutely document the intelligence of nature and the fact that not only animals but plants respond to us. They're in communion with us, and we're not aware of it. And I don't know if they're thinking, oh, those stupid people, but you know, but they have the awareness, and now we're beginning to have it ourselves. But it's not an innovation of highly developed technological human beings. It's been there as part of indigenous cultures for millennia.
Yeah, I think we can't deal with the Anthropocene without spirituality. And people, I mean, almost those of us who are atheists or agnostics are maybe 1% on the planet. And everyone has some kind of engagement, some kind of spirituality. And how are the established churches dealing with it? And there are many who have engaged with the problems of climate change and problems of our spiritual connections, and especially of future generations. And then there are people who are maybe not part of an organized religion, but are spiritual and in communion and connection with nature. And so if we're going to, my hope is that by 2050, we will have a planet that is based on wind, solar, and hydro, and we will have cracked the nut of the Anthropocene.
Yes.
And we will be on the road to a much better sustainable future, and I would call it the age of sustainability. So we get rid of the age of the Anthropocene by 2050, and then we're in the age of sustainability.
And I think that we do this not only, we have to organize against corporations, we have to protest, but we also have to do it in love, that we love what we're preserving, we love the earth, and that's a very profound emotion if it's genuine. And so, and religion can be a way to reach that.
Okay. David, I want to just recognize this is David Kubrin.
Oh, David,
who has
hello.
been a major influence on the death of nature.
And on woman in nature.
And David Kubrin, I'm going to say this before you speak. David Kubrin taught a class in the Liberation School on the 17th century, and it was in 1972, and I took this class from David, and it was David's argument that matter was dead. It used to be vital and alive, but in the 17th century, matter became dead.
Got murdered.
Yeah, and from, so it was much broader than just matter, but all of nature and the Earth Mother died and so on.
Yeah.
So, David, major influence on my work.
And mine too. Yeah.
I'd like to point out in terms of what you raised, that the move to mechanize nature and to assassinate nature through the notion of inertia was an ideological move by powerful men in the Royal Society in reaction to the notion that matter was filled with spirit.
Yes.
And they were aiming against the witches and against indigenous culture, and also, which is less known, against the radical tradition in the English Civil War, which was filled by people, alchemists and astrologers, etc., who believed that spirit was inherent in matter. And it was against those three subsets that the notion of the inert matter and the mechanization was fashioned as an ideological weapon.
Yeah. And I remember, David, what you told me about Newton's secret experiments with alchemy that Newton looked at as the father of mechanistic science, was actually secretly working with alchemical principles that recognize the vitality of matter.
That's the essence of alchemy, is you're working with a living nature.
You're working with something.
And one of David's most foundational papers was published in Liberation magazine in 1972, and it was called "How Sir Isaac Newton Helped Restore Law and Order to the West." And he has a new book which is about to come out, and the title is
Marxism and Witchcraft.
Marxism and Witchcraft.
Wonderful, wonderful. One of the things that I argue with in Woman in Nature is Newton's idea that somehow color, we're being fooled by that color isn't real, that it's just these refractions of light, and modern science still talks as if that's the case. So and I posited that no, it's a collaboration. It is very real, and we're collaborating creatively. In all our sensual knowledge, it's not that the senses are fooling us, as Alexander Pope wrote, as Descartes argued, but that we are collaborating with the material world. And in other words, our senses don't belong to us alone. It's a relational process.
Okay, I think we'll have to wind this up now. But Douglas Brinkley, stand up. He is going to give a talk on Rachel Carson at 7 o'clock down the hill, down Lacott Avenue and across under the Tolman Hall and in 159 Mulford Hall. And so people can gradually make your way down there. And I think some people can, if they don't know the way, can gather in a group and walk down together.
And let me say once again, thank you to the magnificent Carolyn Merchant.
There's still plenty to drink and eat, so please continue the conviviality.